Hello, guys. My name is Damian Macias. I currently just got done with my first year in the program, um, aiming to become an LPCA, as I imagine a lot of you guys are as well. And I was tasked with solution focused brief therapy and motivational interviewing. So, where do we start? Well, guys, today I'm going to be exploring two unique approaches to group therapy, right? As I just mentioned, solution focused brief therapy, which I'll be probably referring to as SFBT in this presentation, just because it's a bit of a mouthful, and I might even go back and forth, but just in case if I say SFBT, that's why. As well as motivational interviewing, also known as MI. And guys, these models are gaining way more attention in the modern clinical spaces due to their adaptability, client centered nature, and effectiveness within group settings. But before we dive into like specifics, right? I want to set like a stage that by discussing the importance of group therapy in general. Now, guys, group therapy, as many of you should know, is a powerful and dynamic modality that leverages interpersonal interaction to promote psychological insight, emotional growth, and behavioral change. And one of the most influential voices, which we learned a lot about in this class, was Irvin Yalom, whose seminal work on interpersonal learning in groups introduced the idea that the here and now, which is, what's happening between people in the room, is a central force in therapeutic change. And according to Yalom, three of the most essential ingredients for change in group therapy are group cohesiveness, interpersonal learning, and experiencing the present moment in the group space. And these processes, guys, they allow clients to connect, confront, and grow in ways that are hard to replicate in individual therapy. But as we all know, as the mental health landscape continues to evolve, especially in response to challenges like rising caseloads, time constraints, and demand for diverse interventions, we've seen the rise of so many different alternative models that push beyond the traditional interpersonal approach, right? And that's where these two guys come in. So SFBT and MI stand out, and these approaches have gained increased recognition for their brevity, flexibility, and strong emphasis on client autonomy and collaborative dialogue, right? So, for example, SFBT doesn't dwell on the past or dive into the origin of problems, but rather it's about building on client strengths to envision a better future, right? Whereas MI tackles a very different problem, right? We're talking more about ambivalence toward change, right? It takes a directive yet collaborative approach and helps individuals resolve inner conflict and build intrinsic motivation to take action, right? And now, guys, before I keep rambling and rambling, the goal of this presentation is not just to describe these models, but to critically compare them. So, things like their theories, strategies, research support, strengths, and limitations, but comparing them all within the context of group therapy. And so, we'll also explore how facilitators can practically apply each in a real world group setting as well. And by the end of this presentation, my hope is that you'll gain a better appreciation of how these two distinct models can enhance group work, especially when it's tailored to the client's needs. And so, with that being said, let's move on to the first thing. Now, guys, solution focused brief therapy, SFBT. It was developed around the early 1980s by a team led by Steve DeShazar and Insel Kimberg at the Brief Family Therapy Center in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And by the way, just to pivot a bit, did not expect this to have been developed in the US, right? But that's neither here nor there. What's important to understand here, guys, is that this model wasn't just an accidental development, right? I mean, it was born out of frustration with existing therapeutic methods at the time. Methods that were long, problem saturated, and often very disempowering to say the least. So instead of focusing what was quote unquote wrong with the client or digging through the past for the source of dysfunction, the Shazur and his team asked a simple yet revolutionary question. And that was, what if we spend more time talking about what's right with the client and where they want to go instead of where they've been, right? This was revolutionary at the time. And that's the core of SFBT. Because rather than focusing on this problem, the approach turns the conversation towards solution. So we're emphasizing things such as client strengths, past successes, and a vision of preferred future. What's awesome too is that SFBT draws heavily from social constructivism, right? And this is a crucial point to understand, guys, because in this framework, reality is not fixed but rather constructed. So that's through language, relationships, meaning making, etc. That means that as a therapist, you're not an expert in diagnosing or solving the client's issue, but rather you're seen as a collaborator who helps the client construct a new story about themselves. And this leads to a very unique therapeutic stance, right? At least at the time. Because in SFBT, the counselor doesn't focus on labeling pathology or dysfunction, but instead it focuses on engaging in what we might call solution talk, right? So it's the intentional redirection of the client's energy away from the problem and going towards goal setting, resource activation, and future orientation. And like I said earlier, guys, this was a major shift in the field. Therapy became not about insight into why someone is struggling, but it became about identifying what's working and how can we do more of it. And so, one of the most compelling features of SFBT is its brevity, right? So, sessions are typically short term, which you're going to see often fewer than 10 sessions, right? Which makes this model highly accessible for diverse populations. So, we can see this being used in schools, maybe community mental health settings, and even correctional facilities, right? And as we'll see later in this presentation, because I have a whole section about it, we'll see like how this flexibility and scalability make it especially useful in group therapy, where time and structure are without a doubt limited. So to just summarize quickly what I just talked about, I was talking about how SFBT is future focused, it is client centered, it's based on the assumption that change is already happening, and it treats the clients as competent, resourceful, and capable of change. And I think that's a beautiful philosophy, right, guys? I mean, especially whenever you're applying it into a group context where shared visions and mutual encouragement can really bring those future goals to life. And now, I do want to shift a little bit now as we're going to be going more into the development of motivational interviewing, which is amazing as well. So, guys, MI also emerged around the early 1980s, which is around the same time as SFBT, coincidentally. But it came from a different place entirely, and I'll expand more on what I mean by that. This approach was developed by William R. Miller, who was a clinical psychologist, and during his work with individuals struggling with alcohol use disorders, he came up with this approach. What's interesting, though, is he was actually later joined by Stephen Rolnick, who expanded its application into healthcare and addiction counseling. Now, at the time, uh, addiction treatments relied on things such as confrontation, scaring them with authority, and even shame based tactics. And therapists would often argue with clients because of this, rightfully so. I mean, why would I go into counseling with somebody who's supposed to be listening to me, at least so I would think, but all they're doing is just confronting me and shaming me? I mean, as a client, I wouldn't want to be there either. I would probably retaliate. And well, Miller found this very troubling. He believed that these methods created defensiveness, resistance, and ultimately it drove clients away from change. And so that's whenever motivational interviewing was born. it's not it's not as radical technique, but as a return to humanistic values, heavily inspired by Carl Rogers, right? So the ideas of empathy, unconditional positive regard, and the belief that people are capable of growth whenever they feel heard or understood. Now, guys, what sets MI apart is that it's both client centered and directive, right? And honestly, on the surface level, that might sound a bit contradictory, but let me explain that. In MI, the therapist doesn't passively reflect. Instead, they're more so guiding. So not by telling them what to do, but by evoking, their own reasons for change. And this guiding stance is captured beautifully in what MI calls its spirit, right? And the spirit is just a term used to describe the core therapeutic attitude, that's all around MI. And it's separated into four key elements. The first one is collaboration. So the therapist and client working as partners, not as an expert, not as a patient, Evocation. This means that the client already has the motivation within them. The therapist's job is just to draw it out. And then acceptance, which is respecting the client's autonomy and worth, as well as compassion, which is just showing that there's a genuine concern for the client's well being. So think of it more so like this, where SFBT helps clients imagine a better future, MI helps clients confront what's holding them back from stepping into that future. Now, because of its roots in addiction work, MI has become incredibly popular in clinical context involving substance use, chronic illness, health behavior changes, and even corrections. But over time, it's evolved into actually like a flexible, evidence based practice that is widely used across settings. So, from individual therapy to health coaching, primary care, and then importantly for our discussion today, group therapy. And one of the most impactful elements of MI, especially in group work, is how it addresses ambivalence. Ambivalence is that stuck place, that many of us find ourselves in. That whole entire I want to change, but I also don't. Rather than trying to confront or trying to convince the client, a therapist who's using MI says, well, let's explore that conflict. And through that exploration, clients begin to voice their own desire, their abilities, and commitment to change. And this process is known as change talk. And we'll explore that in more detail later when we look at techniques. But for now, the main key takeaway from all this is that MI is not about fixing the client. It's about creating a space where they can connect with their own reasons for change and strengthen their motivation from within. So much like SFBT, MI can be brief. It is very much structured and it focuses on what the client can do, but the journey is way more internal. So SFBT might say, let's build your future. MI ask, what's standing in the way? How can we move forward? All right, so let's move on to the next section, guys. And in this section, I want to explore how these two models really come alive in group therapy, right? Where multiple voices, dynamics, and shared experiences shape the change process in a complex and quite powerful way. All right, guys. So, one of the most powerful aspects of group therapy is that clients are no longer working alone, right? You're being surrounded by peers. And what better feeling than to be surrounded by people that are in the same boat as you, right? These are people who can support you, reflect, challenge, and even validate your experiences. And that dynamic fits beautifully within the core principles of SFBT. In group settings, SFBT continues its solution oriented, future focused approach, but with an added layer of peer collaboration, right? So instead of the facilitator being the sole guide, the group itself becomes a catalyst for change. But I'm saying all these words, but it's just like, how does that really work? So let's break it down a little bit better. First things first is that SFBT in groups uses a goal oriented and strength based framework, right? So each member is encouraged to envision a preferred future, and the group helps support that vision. So rather than the group focusing on shared problems like trauma, anxiety, or addiction, the facilitator is more so gently redirecting the dialogue toward individual goals, exceptions, and resources. And one of the most iconic SFBT techniques is known as the miracle question, and I'm sure everybody in this program should be fairly familiar with this. But just to give an example, it could sound like this. Imagine you wake up tomorrow and the problem that you brought with you is gone. What's the first thing that you're going to notice? Whenever you ask this in a group, this question does more than just inspire personal reflection, right? It invites collective hope. Other members listen, they relate, and they even begin to build on each other's visions. It's such a cool idea, right? Because it's creating a ripple effect of future oriented thinking that feels energizing rather than draining, right? And another key technique that we see being used whenever SFBT is in group work is scaling questions. Um, these are very simple, practical tools that measure things like confidence, progress, readiness to change, various different emotions, right? So, for example, a facilitator might ask, on a scale from 0 to 10, how close are you to your goal today? Once they get some type of response, kind of get it up in their minds, follow up with, what would help you move just one number higher? These kinds of questions foster accountability and normalize fluctuation in progress, which is especially helpful in a diverse group of members that are all working at different paces, right? What also makes SFBT so effective in group work is the therapist's role. Rather than acting like the expert with all the answers, the SFBT facilitator takes a collaborative stance, right? They're acting as a curious listener, someone who invites each group member to recognize and speak their own truths. So the counselor in SFBT asks questions more than they offer interpretations. You're reinforcing successes and consistently validating clients' efforts, no matter how small they are. And this approach allows members to feel seen, heard, respected, which enhances group cohesion, guys. I mean, this structure, when sustained over time, is something powerful, right? This group itself begins to embody the SFBT spirit. And that space is forward looking, solution driven, and mutually affirming. So let's kind of give a quick example, real quick, right? Imagine a group of adolescents who are struggling with behavioral issues at school in a traditional model, right? They might spend a lot of time discussing the why, the family, stress, trauma, fights. But in SFBT, guys, that conversation flips, right? So we're talking more so as, what was the time at school you felt proud of yourself? Who noticed that? What did they say? What would it take to have one more day like this, in the week? And suddenly, they're not labeled as troubled youth. They're problem solvers, guys, goal setters, and encouragers for themselves and for one another. And that's the beauty of SFBT, as I keep saying. In group work, its biggest strength is its simplicity, right? It doesn't require advanced clinical interpretations or complex theory. But what it does require is commitment to hope, collaboration, and belief in people's abilities to construct their own path forward, guys. And when these tools are used skillfully in group, we see transformation. Not because the group unpacks every trauma, but because they begin to see themselves differently and act accordingly. And it's so cool. I loved learning about this. Um, Now let's kind of move on to the next slide, right, guys? We're going to shift back to motivational interviewing and explore how its principles and techniques come alive in group dynamics, especially whenever clients are struggling with ambivalence and resistance to change. Alright, guys. So, MI is often praised for its success in one on one settings, especially with clients dealing with addiction, chronic illnesses, or behavior changes. But what's remarkable is how seamlessly its core principles adapt to the group therapy format, where the presence of peers can amplify both resistance and motivation. So, how does MI actually work in group therapy? Well, first things first is we need to revisit what I mentioned earlier in the beginning was MI's guiding spirit, guys. Remember the four components, and that's collaboration, evocation, acceptance, and compassion. These are not just abstract ideas, these are active postures that the facilitator has to embody, especially in the often complex social environment of a group. And one of the most practical tools for achieving this posture is the OARS model, right? And that stands for open ended questions, affirmations, reflective listening, and summarizing. These guys are the cornerstones of how group conversations are facilitated in MI. You know, the counselor uses OARS not to control the group or set the direction, but to create a safe, open space for members to explore their own ambivalence, their values, and eventually their own reasons for change. So, how might this actually play out in a group, right? Let's say a group member named James is saying, I know I should stop drinking, but it's the only way I feel normal around people. The MI facilitator doesn't respond with advice or logic. Instead, they're going to be saying something like, well, it sounds like alcohol helps you feel more socially connected, even though you're conflicted about it. And that's reflective listening, guys. And that's where the change begins to surface. Because change talk is central to MI. And it becomes even more powerful in a group where clients can hear each other voice their struggles out loud. And according to Moyers et al. 2009, change talk, when it comes from the client themselves, is predictive of behavioral outcomes. And in groups, this talk can spread. So one member voices a new insight, another relates, and a third starts to imagine a different possibility. And that's so cool because, I mean, it's like this collective impact that MI is capable of, right? What makes this work is that MI isn't trying to fix anyone, guys. It's simply trying to understand them and help them understand themselves. So, in a group setting, the facilitator's role is less about delivering a message and more about curating a space where change can arise from within the clients and between them. Open ended questions might sound like, what matters most to you about this issue? What would your life be different? Yeah, no. How would your life be different if you made this change? And then affirmations that are used to recognize strengths, especially when clients are vulnerable. Something like, well, you've been incredibly honest with the group today, or the fact that you're even here says a lot about your courage. You know, things like this create a tone that is not only respectful, but it's non judgmental and emotionally resonant, which is vital for groups that might be navigating shame, fear, or just deeply ingrained ambivalence. So let's just take a moment to kind of look at the literature. There was actually a study by Carey et al. Back in 2006 where a randomized control trial examined the effects of a group based MI intervention on college students with heavy drinking behaviors. What they found was striking, right? Participants in this group not only reduced their alcohol use significantly more than those in the control group, but they also reported fewer alcohol related symptoms. And perhaps most importantly, the group format allowed participants to reflect together, right? Supporting one another through moments of discomfort and insight. MI doesn't need to shame them into change. It simply helped them talk their way into readiness, something that was already there. Another powerful example comes from the health psychology field. Hardcastle et al. Back in 2013 implemented in MI based group sessions with patients managing type 2 diabetes, right? The results? Improvements in medication adherence, self efficacy, and overall health behavior. But what stood out was how many participants said the group's atmosphere grounded them in the MI spirit, right? It made them feel heard in ways that they hadn't before. The sense of non judgmental support changed how they saw themselves and their ability to grow. So, that was a lot that I just talked about, guys. I'm not going to lie to y'all. So, let's kind of just reflect real quick what I just talked about. To keep it short and simple, MI and group therapy is not about confrontations, it's about connection. It's structured, yet very flexible, and it leverages the power of shared humanity, letting clients listen, speak, and discover that change is not something done to them, but something that emerges from within with the support of others. In the next section, guys, we'll take a step back and compare these two models side by side, highlighting not just their differences, but also the common grounds that they share in promoting autonomy, empowerment, and grow. And that's all going to start with talking about the different researches. As we just mentioned, we were talking about research in MI, but let's kind of go into the SFBT side of it. How does it work? Let's begin with a meta-analysis done by Kim back in 2008, which remains one of the most cited sources on the effectiveness of SFBT. In this study, Kim evaluated outcomes across multiple clinical settings and found that SFBT had small to moderate effect sizes on mental health indicators such as self-esteem, emotional regulation, and goal attainment. But here's what's especially relevant for our topic today, guys. The group-based versions of SFBT were found to be just as effective, if not more, than the individual versions. Now, you might be asking, why is that? I think it raises an interesting possibility, right? Perhaps peer interaction, group cohesion, or just the act of publicly envisioning your future may amplify the effects of SFBT. And in group therapy, clients not only voice their goals, but they hear others doing the same. And that process may create a collective momentum toward change. And this sort of change was actually echoed in a study done by Franklin et al. Back in 2008, which looked at SFBT, but in a school-based group counseling program, right? And this program was made for students that were at risk of academic failure. What was fascinating was that after just 5 group sessions, students showed significant improvements in classroom behavior, engagement, motivation toward academic achievement, which is kind of insane to think about, right? I mean, in only 5 group sessions, they were able to show significant improvements. Like, this is amazing. What's striking here is that the brevity of the intervention, 5 sessions, yet it still produced measurable behavioral change. Going on forward, there was a similar study by Newsom back in 2004 that also examined SFBT with, this time, at-risk junior high students. And the results? Participants in the group reported increased self-efficacy, showed reduced symptoms of depression, and demonstrated more positive school-related behaviors. Again, we see the same pattern. Brief, focused group work that leads to real outcomes, especially with the adolescent populations, where engagement can be particularly difficult. I mean, think back to whenever you guys were a junior high. Like, would something like this have helped y'all? But SFBT's reach goes beyond just the youth populations, right, guys? In a systematic review by Gingrich and Peterson back in 2013, there were studies analyzed across correctional settings, healthcare, and just general clinical environments. And specifically within incarcerated populations, SFBT group sessions were associated with reduced recidivism, greater group engagement, and improved goal-directed behavior. One study even noted that group members began reinforcing each other's solution building, which created a culture of positive accountability that extended beyond the therapy room. So what does that all tell us? While SFBT is not a deep dive model because it doesn't unpack trauma or analyze transference, once again, its simplicity is its strength. In a group setting, that simplicity becomes even more effective because, once again, goals are shared, progress is observed, hope is contagious. In a sense, SFBT groups function like forward looking communities, right? Where the focus isn't on fixing on what's broken, but on building what's next together. So, to close this section, I really just want to emphasize that SFBT, despite its brief structure, offers a robust and evidence supported framework, especially in resource limited environments like schools, corrections, or low income clinics. It offers an efficient, empowering, and flexible tool for group facilitation. Now, guys, um, in our next slide, we're going to be looking at motivational interviewing and its research based in group context, which, as you'll see, has compelling support across various diverse populations. As I mentioned earlier, guys, MI was originally designed for individual therapy, particularly in the treatment of alcohol use disorders. But over time, it's expanded, and the research now shows that MI in group settings can be just as effective, if not more so, when applied skillfully. So let's begin back with the study of Carey et al. Of 2006. Now, once again, this was a randomized controlled trial that investigated the impact of group-based MI interventions on heavy drinking college students. The the participants were randomly assigned to either a motivational interviewing group or a control group that received standard educational materials. And like I mentioned earlier a couple slides ago, the results were compelling, guys. The MI group showed a significant reduction in alcohol use, fewer alcohol related problems, and a stronger sense of self regulation after the intervention. What's especially relevant here is the role of the group context. Participants weren't just responding to the facilitator, they were hearing their peers share their own ambivalence, fears, and reason for change. And that peer resonance added something unique that individual therapy couldn't fully replicate. I think it goes back to imagine like that you're stuck on a boat, right, in the middle of the ocean, and you are by yourself. There's not much that you can do. You're just left in your own thoughts. Whereas you're stuck on a boat with 4 or 5 people, there's some sort of comfort in that. You guys are all going through the same exact thing. A broader perspective comes from a meta analysis by Lundahl and Burke back in 2009, which analyzed data from 119 studies, guys. I mean, some of the key findings in this was MI had moderate but consistent effect sizes across behavioral outcomes. The results were strongest in substance use and health behavior change settings, and group interventions were found to be particularly effective when targeting behaviors with high ambivalence, such as smoking cessations, alcohol use, and weight management. And I think that last point is actually worth emphasizing. Ambivalence is a space where MI shines. And when that ambivalence is explored in a group, members can begin to process their internal conflicts externally. So, things like dialogue, feedback, and support. Another study that I also want to talk about that extends MI's reach is by Hardcastle et al. 2013, which we also talked about earlier. This study involved group MI interventions for patients managing type 2 diabetes, a context where behavioral change, things like diet, medication, physical activity are absolutely essential. Like I had mentioned earlier, after a series of MI-based group sessions, participants reported improved self-efficacy, better medication adherence, and measurable improvements in overall health behaviors. What stood out in this study, guys, wasn't just the clinical outcomes, but the participant feedback. People said that the group settings helped them feel seen, heard, feel less alone, and they described a sense of mutual encouragement. One participant specifically verbatim said, hearing someone else struggle with the same things made me believe I could change too. And there's beauty in that, There's beauty in the quote unquote struggle. These findings suggest that Group based MI doesn't just work, it thrives in environments where clients lack confidence, they feel stuck or conflicted, or just need help moving on from intention to action. What makes MI especially powerful is how it activates change talk in a social setting, right? As clients hear themselves and others express goals, doubts, values, their motivation starts to formulate and even crystallize. And this is supported by Myers et al. Back in 2009, who demonstrated that change talk during MI sessions is directly correlated with positive behavioral outcomes. So, what can we really just conclude from all this research? For starters, MI is flexible across populations, from college students all the way to patients with chronic illnesses. Um, it's effective in groups, particularly where change is difficult and emotionally charged, and it's built on a foundation of empathy, autonomy, and shared reflection, all of which translate remarkably well to the group format. In fact, many facilitators now recommend MI for long term support groups where ambivalence might, you know, mess up with like the flow over time. It's not just about change in one session, guys. It's about sustained motivation that's built week by week, which is different from SFBT. Give me a quick moment. I need to get a drink of water. All right. So, guys, let's move on to the next session. We're going to be shifting into a more direct comparison of SFBT and MI in group therapy. So, we'll be looking at how they differ, where they overlap, and when one might be preferred over the other depending on group dynamics, population, and treatment goals. And so let's go straight into it. SFBT versus MI. First, guys, let's acknowledge the shared values between these two models, right? Both SFBT and MI are client centered, they are collaborative, strength based, and focus on facilitating change without imposing it. They emphasize autonomy, collaboration, and respect for the client's internal wisdom. And in group therapy, both models recognize that healing can be amplified when people hear their stories reflected by others. But despite these similarities, guys, they differ in a few key ways, especially in their orientation, strategic focus, and their emotional depth. So let's kind of break this down a little bit. Looking at it from a just a theoretical orientation, SFBT is rooted in social constructivism, guys. So it's viewing problems as fluid narratives that are shaped by language and context. And the therapist helps clients rewrite their story in a more empowering direction. We sort of see that in MI. MI, on the other hand, is grounded in humanistic psychology, right? So it's taken a lot of inspiration from the work of Carl Rogers, and specifically, as it emphasizes empathy, ambivalence, and internal motivation as key drivers of change, right? Next, I want to go on to like the strategic focuses. SFBT is solution oriented, right? We know this. It's about helping clients identify goals, visualize success, and build actionable steps. And there's minimal focus on the problem's origin. Instead, it's more of asking what's working and how can we do more of it. MI, on the other hand, is ambivalence focused. It's recognizing that people often know what they need to do, they're just stuck emotionally or cognitively in it. So MI is saying, let's explore why you're stuck and how you really feel about changing. So as far as like usefulness by context, guys, SFBT is ideal for short-term, goal-driven group work, right? Populations that are ready for action. So we can be looking at schools, job coaching opportunities, and brief counseling programs, whereas MI is definitely better suited for a longer term change, right? So groups that are dealing with substance use, chronic illnesses, or other behavioral health conditions, situations where readiness for change varies widely, right? Let's shift a little bit also to the group dynamics of each of these. In SFBT, groups tend to feel energized, right? So solution focused and hopeful. Members support each other's goals, they give feedback on progress, and they help build collective momentum. In MI, groups often feel reflective, empathic, empathetic, and emotionally resonant, but there's this strong emphasis on narrative sharing, right, guys? Affirmation of your peers and helping members resolve inner conflict about change. So, obviously, we've talked a lot about what SFBT is good at, what MI is good at, how they differ, how they're alike. But I, I feel like I wanna put it more so like in an analogy, right? So imagine if a client group is a car that isn't working, right? SFBT is saying, what direction do you want to go? What small step can we take to get there? Whereas MI is more so asking the question of, let's figure this out. What's keeping your foot on the brake? Both are completely valid, right? And they both offer different kinds of support depending on where the group is in their processes. And it's really cool, right? To think when you think about it, because it's two solutions to the same problem, right? That's just so cool about counseling in general. I think it's also worth noting, guys, that these approaches don't have to be mutually exclusive, right? In some group settings, especially those with diverse levels of readiness, I think a hybrid approach could actually work fairly well. For example, you might start with MI to help resolve ambivalence, right? But then shift to SFBT to build that momentum once motivation emerges. This kind of flexibility, integrative approach allows facilitators to meet clients where they are and adapt as the group evolves. And it almost feels like you might even be doing the group a disservice by not mixing a bit of both. Take a bit of take the best of both worlds. I mean, two's better than one type of thing. So to recap, guys, in this comparison, SFBT, action, structure, future building. MI is about exploration, emotional insight, and finding out where your values align. Both promote empowerment. They both work in groups, and they definitely offer meaningful evidence-based pathways to change. Up next, though, we're going to be looking at how group facilitators can apply these insights in real world settings. So, specific tools, techniques, and considerations to keep in mind when leading group sessions. And let's move to that. Let's look at this at a practical level, guys, because at the end of the day, what matters most is this. How do we, as group facilitators, actually use these models with real people in real rooms as they face real world problems? So, in this section, we're going to be specifically talking about how to walk through, how to structure sessions, how to engage clients, what to emphasize, and how to handle the flow of conversation based on whether you're using SFBT or MI. So let's begin with solution-focused brief therapy. If you're leading an SFBT group, your primary stance is that of a non-expert collaborator. You are there to highlight what is working, affirming progress, and guiding clients towards visualizing and building their preferred future. Now, here are some key facilitating strategies, right? Number one, begin with directional warm-ups. Don't waste time on dwelling on what's wrong. Instead, use exercises that immediately orient the group towards solutions. So questions like, what's one thing that went well for you this week? Who here took a small step toward a personal goal recently, right? and making sure to use your bag of tools. Like we mentioned earlier, the use of the miracle question. This can be introduced in a session like where energy is low or the group is stuck. Have members close their eyes and imagine waking up to find their problem completely resolved. Then ask, what would be the first sign that something changed? And how would others notice? This opens the door to hopeful language, guys. I mean, self reflection and peer affirmation. Step three, reinforcing progress, not perfection. Use scaling question, guys. On a scale from on a scale from 0 to 10, where are you now? And what would one step higher look like? Let group members respond to one another. I mean, this builds peer-based problem solving, and do not interpret. If someone says something powerful, rather than summarizing it, ask, how did it feel to say that? What does that tell you about what you're capable of? Simple things like that. Remember that your job is to pull out their inner knowledge, not analyze for them. So now let's switch over to motivational interviewing, guys. Facilitating an MI group requires a different rhythm for sure. I mean, MI is softer in tone, deeper in reflection, and often moves, for lack of better words, it moves slower than SFBT, right? So, as a facilitator, your job is to create psychological safety, evoke change talk, and gently explore ambivalence. Some key strategies that you can begin with in the warm up might include something like, what's something you care about deeply? Or what brought you here today, even if part of you didn't want to come? These open the floor to authentic, conflicted voices, which is exactly what MI is designed to work with. Using the ORS communication method consistently is also something that we need to focus on. Asking open ended questions. What would change look like for you? Offer affirmations. It sounds like you've been trying really hard. Reflect on what you're hearing. You want to quit, but it also scares you. Did I get that right? And then summarize group themes at the end of each round. Here's what I heard from everyone today. You need to highlight and reflect change talk as well. When a member is expressing, desirability or reason for change, reflect it back to them, guys. You mentioned that you'd like to feel more in control again. What would that mean for you? Encouraging the group to do the same for each other, not to fix, but to notice or reinforce motivation, right? And be patient with the silence, guys. We hear it so much in this program where silence is sometimes the best thing that you can do. MI groups often have moments where members are unsure of what to say, and that's okay, guys. Silence is productive in MI. It gives clients time to reflect and lets insights emerge naturally rather than being pushed, which is something that we want to facilitate. In both SFBT and MI, the facilitator's attitude is just as important as their technique. You are curious, not judgmental, supportive, not directive, and most importantly, you're a mirror, not a megaphone. So whether you're helping clients build a future with SFBT or uncover their reasons for change, like MI, your job is to create the conditions for their own voice to emerge and for the group to become a source of strength, not shame. And I think one last tidbit that I want to talk about before we transition to the next slide is always adapt to your structure based on who's in the room, guys. With adolescents, SFBT may resonate more quickly, whereas if you're working with people that are in recovery, MI's depth and pacing might be essential. There is no one size fits all, though. It's just good questions, empathetic presence, and willingness to let clients lead. So coming up next, we'll take a step back, guys, and consider the limitations of these models, because I've been talking nothing but good about these guys, but there's definitely some limitations, places where they fall short, and then we can also talk about the future directions that might help address those gaps in practice. So moving on to this slide. Limitations and future directions. Every therapeutic model, no matter how innovative or evidence-based, comes with limitations. And that's why no model is ever changing the same, and that's why new models are made as well. So in this section, we want to take an honest look at what this really means and how these two can be better, especially in group therapy settings. Let's start with solution focused brief therapy. As you've seen, SFBT is grounded in hope, strengths, and goal setting. And that's a beautiful thing. There's nothing wrong with that, especially for clients who are ready to move forward, right? But here's the critique: SFBT can sometimes move way too fast. Its intense future orientation might leave little room for clients who are still grappling with the past, navigating trauma, or struggling to access hope in the first place. You know, I this is completely like off topic, but it's like when you tell a depressed person to be sad, right? Like, sorry, I meant when you tell a depressed person to be happy. How do you ex- how do you how do you expect them to be happy whenever they're depressed? And that's kind of like the whole entire thing about, how are you going to tell these people to get hope whenever there is no hope in the first place? So, for example, a client who is newly bereaved, recently abused, or maybe even actively suicidal may not benefit from being asked to imagine their preferred future, right? Because they're still stuck in the present right now, and who could blame them? In those moments, the present is too heavy and the future feels too far away. But as Franklin et al. In 2017 noted, SFBT has to be used for clinical discernment, as it works well for many populations, but not all. And in group settings, the pressure to be hopeful might cause some members to feel invalidated or disconnected from the group process. On the other hand, guys, motivational interviewing brings its own set of challenges. MI depends heavily on the facilitator's skill in guiding conversations, especially when it comes to using ORs, so responding to resistance and evoking change talk without sounding manipulative. And that's hard enough in individual sessions, right, guys? Now imagine that in group therapy, having more than one person, that's the complexity multiplies. Clients are at different stages in readiness, emotions running high. One could be resistant or dominant voice. One resistant or dominant voice can shift the entire room. And Miller and Rolnick back in 2013 emphasized the importance of maintaining that MI spirit, collaborating, evocation, acceptance, and compassion. But when working with multiple clients, guys, it's easy to fall into this type of lecture mode or default to advice giving, especially under time pressure. I mean, let's say that the session is only like an hour, 45 minutes long. That's already small for just one person. How do you get through with like 8, 10 people? That's a lot of pressure. I think additionally too, MI is, while brilliant for behavioral change, may not always address, systematic barriers, relational trauma, or even identity-based struggles that are central to a client's experience. And in groups, those layers often surface whether we invite them to or not. So, what can we do about these limitations? That's where we shift to future directions, guys. I mean, areas where both models can continue to evolve and respond to the complex needs of today's clients. Number one, trauma informed integration. Both SFBT and MI would benefit greatly from being integrated with trauma informed care principles, especially in groups. And that's going to mean, creating emotional safety, acknowledging the impact of trauma on readiness and self perception, and making room for slowness, silence, or even anger. Clients who've experienced trauma may need to process the past before imagining the future, or build trust before committing to change. Next is just cultural responsiveness. Um, Both models are highly adaptable, right? But they often default to Western values such as independence, internal motivation, and self direction. In collectivist cultures or marginalized communities, these assumptions might not hold up. For example, in some cultures, goals are defined by family, not individuals. Ambivalence may be rooted in systematic oppression, not internal conflict, and strengths may be expressed through community ties and not personal traits. You know, as facilitators, we need to recognize and respect these dynamics and adjust our approaches accordingly, guys. Another thing is just in real world, like, therapy rarely stays inside the lines of one model, right? So many clinicians are now blending SFBT and MI or integrating them with models like CBT, narrative therapy, DBT, you name it. For example, an MI session might start with value clarification, then shift into solution building when readiness emerges, or an SFBT group might pause to allow for deeper emotional work when the group signals a need for it. These integrative approaches allow for more flexibility, cultural sensitivity, and client driven pacing. So basically, like I was saying earlier, where two is better than one, don't get so caught up in one model that you forget that you have a whole entire bag of other things that you can pull from, right? And ultimately, guys, what this is telling us is that models are not prescriptions, they're tools, as I just said. And like any good craftsman, our job is to understand the tool, know when to use it, and adapt it when the situation calls for something different. You know, both SFBT and MI have tremendous values, but they're just not one size fits all. The future of these approaches lies in how we use and, as practitioners, contextualize, blend, and evolve them to serve the diverse human beings in front of us. Now, guys, let's bring it all together, you know. Let's review the key takeaways and the broader implications of using these two models in group therapy. Conclusion, guys. As we come to the end of this presentation, guys, I want to take a moment to just reflect on what we've learned. And more importantly, why it all matters. You know, we've spent time examining two powerful approaches to group therapy. One, solution focused brief therapy, which focuses on what's possible, and motivational interviewing, which explores what's holding us back. At first glance, guys, these two models might seem very different. SFBT is forward moving, concise, and centered around hope and goals, whereas MI might seem slower, deeper, and centered around values and ambivalence. But what they share and what makes them both so essential in today's group therapy landscape is their faith in the client. Both models believe that change doesn't come from pressure or authority, but from within the individual. You know, something that was always there. And in a group setting, they show us that this internal process can be amplified when surrounded by others who are, walking similar, though never identical paths. So let's briefly revisit some of these key takeaways. Once again, SFBT builds on strengths, not deficits. It uses goal setting, miracle questions, and scaling to spark momentum. And it's especially useful, guys, in short term group contexts like schools, community settings, or brief interventions. MI, on the other hand, works through ambivalence, not resistance. So it uses tools like ORs to do this, and change talk as well to increase intrinsic motivation. It's particularly effective as well with long-term behavioral change and substance use populations. And both are supported by decades of research, guys. These these things aren't new. They were both uh, created in the 1980s. This is this is stuff that has been empirically reviewed, researched. So you can definitely thinking of the word. You can have confidence that both of these uh, methods are successful in what they do. But what we also discovered, guys, is that neither model is really perfect, right? SFBT risks bypassing emotional complexity, and MI relies on high facilitator skill and emotional pacing. And we also explored how these limitations can be addressed. Things like trauma-informed practices, cultural adaptations, and flexible integrations with other models can definitely not necessarily make them perfect, but just make them better. And more broadly, both of these frameworks represent something larger happening in our field, guys. It's a movement away from pathology based therapy, and it's moving towards empowerment based therapy. It's a shift away, guys. We're no longer telling clients what to do. We're more so helping them hear their own voice clearly. And for a lot of people, it's the first time that they're ever hearing it. And group therapy, when it's shared with its shared stories and collective wisdom, is one of the most powerful spaces to make happen. So if there's one message that I hope that each of you take away from today is that whether we're using SFBT, MI, or something in between, our job is not to create change in our clients, guys. Our job is to create the space where the change becomes possible. And whenever that happens, especially in a group, it becomes a container for hope, reflection, strength, and connection. And the work truly begins to transform lives, guys. I would like to thank all of you guys for listening. And if there were people in front of me, I would take questions, comments, or reflections as well. But unfortunately, there is nobody here. I do want to show off a quick references right there. But other than that, the presentation is over. And I hope that everyone has a good rest of their day.